April 12, 1945. A warm spring afternoon in Washington. Vice President Harry Truman had just finished presiding over the Senate and was heading to House Speaker Sam Rayburn's office for a drink when an urgent message arrived: "Come to the White House immediately." When he arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt met him. Her husband, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was dead. Truman asked if there was anything he could do for her. Her response would prove prophetic. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." At 7:09 that evening, Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the oath of office. Harry Truman, a man who had been vice president for exactly 82 days, was now the 33rd president of the United States. He told reporters the next day, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Truman had no idea what he was walking into. Over the next 18 months, he would systematically dismantle Franklin Roosevelt's entire political infrastructure, replacing virtually everyone who had worked closely with the man who had been president for 12 years. Some historians call it a necessary transition. Others see it as one of the most dramatic purges in presidential history. The truth lies somewhere in between, in a story of power, loyalty, insecurity, and the impossible burden of following a giant. This is the story of how Harry Truman inherited an empire he didn't understand, staffed by people who didn't trust him, and how he tore it all down to build something new. Chapter 1. A President Kept in the Dark. To understand why Truman replaced so many Roosevelt officials, you first have to understand just how unprepared he was to be president. And that unpreparedness wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. Harry Truman had been added to the 1944 Democratic ticket for purely political reasons. The party bosses knew Roosevelt was dying. His health had been deteriorating for months, maybe years. They needed a successor, but they couldn't have Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's current vice president, who was too liberal and too idealistic for their tastes, so they picked Truman, a border state senator, a loyal Democrat, someone who could win the South but wouldn't scare moderates. Roosevelt accepted the arrangement, but showed virtually no interest in preparing his new vice president for the presidency. Between January 20th, when Truman was sworn in as vice president, and April 12th, when Roosevelt died, the two men met privately only twice. Twice, in 82 days. Truman was not invited to cabinet meetings. He was not shown classified intelligence reports. He was not briefed on military strategy or diplomatic negotiations. He was, in the words of one historian, kept as far from power as possible, while technically being next in line for it. The list of things Truman didn't know on April 12, 1945, is staggering. He had no idea the Manhattan Project existed. The atomic bomb, the most powerful weapon ever created, the device that would end the war with Japan and reshape global politics for generations, was a complete secret to him. He wasn't told about it until April 25th, nearly 2 weeks after becoming president, when Secretary of War Henry Stimson came to the Oval Office and said, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world." Truman didn't know the details of the agreements Roosevelt had made with Stalin at Yalta. He didn't understand the extent of Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe, or the commitments America had made regarding Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. He had to learn about these on the fly, while preparing for the Potsdam Conference with Churchill and Stalin just 3 months after taking office. He wasn't briefed on Roosevelt's plans for the occupation of Germany. He didn't know about the internal debates over whether to pursue a harsh peace that would prevent German rearmament or a more conciliatory approach that would rebuild Europe's economy. He would have to make these decisions without understanding what Roosevelt had intended. He had never been shown post-war economic planning documents. Roosevelt and his team had been working for months on plans to transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy, but none of this information was shared with Truman. He walked into the presidency facing the challenge of demobilizing millions of troops and retooling American industry without any preparation. Roosevelt's staff had deliberately excluded him. They saw him as a placeholder, a political necessity, not a real partner in governing, and they made no effort to hide it. Years later, Truman would write in his diary about those first days. "I was the most uninformed president in history. I had to rely on Roosevelt's people to tell me what was going on, and I quickly realized that many of them were not telling me everything. Some because they honestly didn't think I needed to know yet. Others because they didn't think I was capable of understanding. And a few because they actively wanted to keep me in the dark so they could continue running things the way Roosevelt would have wanted." This created an impossible situation. Truman needed Roosevelt's team because they had the knowledge and experience he lacked, but he also couldn't fully trust them because they had proven willing to keep vital information from him. This tension would define his entire first year in office and would ultimately lead to the wholesale replacement of Roosevelt's inner circle. The Manhattan Project revelation was particularly traumatic. On April 25th, Stimson came to the White House with General Leslie Groves, the military head of the project. They brought a detailed report on the bomb's development and its potential impact. Truman was stunned. Here was a weapon that could destroy entire cities, that could end the war with Japan, that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the world, and he, the President of the United States, was just now learning it existed. His immediate question was, what else don't I know? What other massive secrets are hidden in the government? What other decisions did Roosevelt make that I'm going to discover months from now? This paranoia was not unfounded. Over the coming weeks and months, Truman would repeatedly discover major commitments, agreements, and policies that he had never been told about. Each discovery reinforced his belief that Roosevelt's team saw him as an outsider, someone to be managed rather than someone to be served. The Yalta agreements were another shock. When Truman asked for briefings on what Roosevelt had agreed to with Stalin, he got varying accounts that seemed designed to protect Roosevelt's legacy rather than inform the new president. Some advisors downplayed the concessions Roosevelt had made. Others emphasized that Stalin had promised free elections in Poland, conveniently failing to mention how vague those promises had been, or how unlikely Stalin was to honor them. Truman began to realize that Roosevelt had operated the presidency as a highly personal enterprise. He had made decisions based on relationships and conversations that were never fully documented. He had promised things to Churchill and Stalin that weren't written down anywhere. He had told different people different things, sometimes contradictory, and then let them figure out what he really meant. This style of leadership had worked for Roosevelt because he was brilliant at managing personalities and keeping everyone slightly off balance. But it created chaos for his successor, who had to piece together American policy from fragments and second-hand accounts. One Roosevelt official later admitted, "We didn't prepare Truman because we didn't think we needed to. We all believed Roosevelt would serve out his term. And frankly, some of us thought that if Roosevelt did die, we could continue running things ourselves. We knew how Roosevelt thought. We knew what he wanted. We figured we could guide Truman in the right direction." This attitude would prove fatal to their positions. Truman had no intention of being guided. He was the president now, and he was going to make his own decisions. But first, he needed to figure out what was actually going on. The first month was a whirlwind of discovery and adjustment. Germany surrendered on May 8th, Truman's 61st birthday, giving him a brief honeymoon period. But behind the scenes, he was struggling to understand the government he now led. He was reading reports late into the night, asking questions, demanding explanations, and growing increasingly frustrated with the people around him. He began to notice patterns. Roosevelt's people would phrase things in ways that subtly limited his options. They would present him with recommendations that were really ultimatums. They would invoke Roosevelt's name constantly, as if that settled every question. President Roosevelt believed, President Roosevelt wanted, President Roosevelt would have. Truman grew tired of hearing about what Roosevelt would have done. Roosevelt was dead. He was president now, and he was determined to lead in his own way, even if that meant disappointing or dismissing the people who had served his predecessor. But he also knew he needed time. He couldn't simply fire everyone immediately. The war was still ongoing in the Pacific. The United Nations was being established, post-war planning was underway. He needed continuity, at least for a while, so he made a decision. He would keep Roosevelt's team in place long enough to win the war and handle the immediate post-war crises. But then, once things stabilized, he would build his own administration. He would replace the Roosevelt loyalists with people loyal to him, people who saw him as the president, not as a caretaker for Roosevelt's legacy. That process would begin in June 1945 and would continue for over a year, and it would be far more dramatic and far-reaching than anyone expected. Chapter 2: Roosevelt's Secret World. To understand who Truman needed to replace, you have to understand the extraordinary group of people who surrounded Franklin Roosevelt. They weren't just advisors or cabinet members. They were, in many ways, a political priesthood, guardians of a vision for America that had been shaped over 12 years of New Deal programs and wartime leadership. Harry Hopkins was perhaps the most influential. He had been Roosevelt's closest advisor, living in the White House for years, serving as his personal emissary to Churchill and Stalin, and wielding enormous, behind-the-scenes power. Hopkins was brilliant, devoted, and completely committed to Roosevelt's vision. He was also dying of cancer, which limited his ability to continue serving. He would resign in July 1945 and die in January 1946. But even in his diminished state, Hopkins represented the kind of advisor Truman couldn't fully trust, someone whose loyalty was to Roosevelt's memory rather than to the new president. Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's former vice president, was now Secretary of Commerce. Wallace was an idealist, a progressive who believed in cooperation with the Soviet Union and extensive government intervention in the economy. He was popular with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party and saw himself as the rightful heir to Roosevelt's legacy. He believed, probably correctly, that party bosses had stolen the 1944 vice presidential nomination from him to give it to Truman. This created tension from the start. Frances Perkins was Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever to hold a cabinet position. She had served since 1933, longer than any other Labor secretary before or since. Perkins was the architect of Social Security, a champion of workers' rights, and a towering figure in New Deal history. She was also deeply loyal to Roosevelt and made no secret of her belief that Truman was not the man for the job. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was Secretary of the Treasury, one of Roosevelt's closest personal friends. The two families had been neighbors in New York. They had lunch together every Monday for years. Morgenthau had financed the New Deal and the war effort, raising more money than all previous Treasury secretaries combined. He expected to continue in his position indefinitely and was shocked when Truman made clear he had other plans. Francis Biddle was Attorney General, a sophisticated Philadelphia lawyer who had managed the Justice Department during the war. Biddle was a civil libertarian who had opposed the internment of Japanese Americans, though he had ultimately acquiesced to political pressure. He represented the kind of Eastern establishment figure that Truman, a product of Missouri machine politics, instinctively distrusted. Admiral William Leahy was Roosevelt's chief of staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the government. Leahy had essentially run the military side of the White House for Roosevelt, coordinating with the Joint Chiefs and managing war planning. He was experienced, knowledgeable, and completely devoted to Roosevelt's approach to military strategy. Sam Rosenman was Roosevelt's speechwriter and counsel, the man who had crafted many of FDR's most famous addresses. Rosenman could imitate Roosevelt's voice and thinking so well that his drafts often needed little revision. He represented the kind of institutional memory that was invaluable but also constraining for a new president trying to find his own voice. James Burns was Secretary of State for a time, though he had a complicated relationship with Truman. Burns had actually received more votes than Truman for the vice presidential nomination in 1944 before party leaders swung behind the Missouri Senator. Burns believed he should have been president and never fully accepted Truman's authority. And then there was Eleanor Roosevelt. While not a government employee, she had been deeply involved in policy during FDR's presidency, especially on issues of civil rights and social welfare. She continued to try to influence policy after her husband's death, offering advice to Truman and advocating for causes she believed Franklin would have supported. These people, and dozens of others like them, had operated as a closed system for years. They knew how Roosevelt thought. They knew what he wanted, even when he didn't explicitly say it. They had learned to interpret his moods, anticipate his decisions, and operate with minimal direct supervision because they understood his goals so thoroughly. This system had enormous advantages. Roosevelt could delegate vast authority because he trusted his people to act in his interests. Decisions could be made quickly without extensive consultation. The administration could present a unified front because everyone was working from the same playbook. But it also had a fatal flaw. It was built entirely around Roosevelt's personality and judgment. When Roosevelt died, the system didn't have a clear way to transition to a new leader. The people in it saw themselves as guardians of Roosevelt's legacy, not as servants of whoever happened to be president next. Many of them genuinely believed that the best way to serve the country was to continue Roosevelt's policies regardless of what Truman wanted. They thought they knew better than this inexperienced senator from Missouri what America needed. They saw it as their duty to guide Truman, to prevent him from making mistakes, to preserve what Roosevelt had built. Truman saw it differently. He saw a group of people who had deliberately kept him in the dark, who condescended to him, who invoked a dead man's authority to limit his options, and who seemed more interested in serving Roosevelt's memory than in serving the living president. The tension was there from the start, but it took time to become open conflict. In those first months, everyone was on their best behavior. Roosevelt's people wanted to give Truman a chance. Truman wanted to learn from their experience. There was a genuine effort to make it work, but underneath the surface, fundamental incompatibilities were emerging. Truman was discovering that he disagreed with Roosevelt on many key issues. He was more skeptical of Soviet intentions, more concerned about government spending, more willing to confront labor unions, less interested in grand ideological crusades. Every time he expressed these differences, Roosevelt's people pushed back, not directly, but through careful framing of options, selective presentation of information, and constant references to what Roosevelt would have done. They weren't trying to be obstructionist. They genuinely believed they were helping. But the effect was to make Truman feel like a prisoner of his predecessor's legacy. The breaking point would come in the summer of 1945, when Truman realized he couldn't govern effectively with Roosevelt's team. He needed people who would implement his decisions, not second-guess them. People who would present him with honest options, not try to manipulate him toward predetermined conclusions. People who saw Harry Truman as the president, not as a poor substitute for Franklin Roosevelt. The purge was about to begin, and it would reshape the executive branch for years to come. Chapter 3. What they hid from Truman. The full extent of what Roosevelt's team had hidden from Truman only became clear over time, through a series of painful discoveries that reinforced his determination to build his own administration. Roosevelt's declining health was perhaps the most shocking revelation. Everyone in the inner circle knew the president was dying. The doctors knew, the cabinet members knew, Eleanor knew, the senior White House staff knew, but nobody told Truman. Roosevelt's personal physician, Vice Admiral Ross McIntyre, had been covering up the president's condition for months. FDR had severe hypertension, congestive heart failure, and was showing signs of cerebral arteriosclerosis. He had lost weight dramatically. His hands trembled. He had trouble concentrating for extended periods. At the Yalta conference in February 1945, Churchill and Stalin had both been shocked by his appearance. But none of this was shared with the vice president. Truman attended 2 meetings with Roosevelt in his 82 days as VP, and both times Roosevelt seemed tired but not alarmingly ill. No one mentioned that the president could barely get through a full day of work. No one suggested that Truman should start preparing for the possibility of succession. Years later, several Roosevelt officials would admit they knew the president was dying but couldn't bring themselves to face it. They had relied on Roosevelt for so long, through the Depression and the war, that imagining American government without him seemed impossible. So they simply didn't imagine it. They kept working as if Roosevelt would always be there, and they avoided the uncomfortable task of preparing his successor. This was more than negligence. It was a betrayal of their constitutional duty. But they didn't see it that way at the time. They were so consumed with winning the war and managing the post-war transition that preparing the vice president seemed like a distraction from more urgent tasks. The Manhattan Project briefing on April 25th was a turning point. Secretary of War Henry Stimson arrived at the White House with a 24-page report on the atomic bomb. He explained that America had spent $2 billion, the equivalent of well over $30 billion today, on a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. It would be ready for testing in July and could be used against Japan soon after. Truman's reaction, recorded in his diary, was one of shock, followed by anger. "I have been president for 13 days, and I am just now learning that we have been building the most powerful weapon in history. What else hasn't been told to me? What other decisions are being made without my knowledge?" He began demanding full briefings on everything. He wanted to know about every major program, every diplomatic commitment, every pending decision. His staff scrambled to compile information, but the process revealed how little had been documented. Roosevelt had operated largely through personal conversations and informal agreements. Much of his decision-making had never been written down. The Yalta Conference agreements were particularly problematic. Roosevelt had met with Churchill and Stalin in February 1945 and made a series of commitments about post-war Europe. But the details were vague and the interpretations varied. When Truman asked what exactly had been agreed to regarding Poland, he got different answers from different people. Some said Roosevelt had accepted Soviet control of Eastern Europe as inevitable and tried to get the best deal possible. Others insisted Roosevelt had extracted promises of free elections that Stalin was now violating. Still others claimed the whole thing was ambiguous and Roosevelt had intended to work out the details later. Truman began to suspect that Roosevelt had deliberately kept things vague so he could adjust his approach based on how events unfolded. This flexibility had been a Roosevelt strength, but it left Truman with no clear policy to continue. He had to make his own decisions about how to deal with Stalin without really knowing what Roosevelt had promised or intended. The discovery of Soviet intelligence penetration added another layer of complexity. In 1945, American intelligence was beginning to uncover evidence that the Soviet Union had placed spies throughout the American government. Some of these spies had access to Roosevelt's inner circle. This wasn't publicly known yet, but Truman was being briefed on it privately. This information made him even more suspicious of Roosevelt holdovers, not because he thought they were all spies, but because he worried that information was leaking to Moscow through channels that Roosevelt's people either didn't know about or hadn't adequately controlled. He needed to ensure that his administration wasn't compromised, and that meant replacing people who might be security risks, knowingly or unknowingly. The extent of commitments to the Soviet Union was startling. Through Lend-Lease and other programs, America had provided massive aid to the USSR during the war. Some Roosevelt officials wanted to continue this aid as a way to maintain good relations. Others argued it gave Stalin leverage over American policy. Truman had to sort through these conflicting recommendations without fully understanding what Roosevelt had intended. Roosevelt's health had been hidden so effectively that even some cabinet members didn't realize how sick he was. They had seen him looking tired, but they assumed it was just the stress of managing a global war. When he died suddenly at Warm Springs, Georgia, many of them were genuinely shocked, despite having worried about his health for months. This conspiracy of silence had been motivated by good intentions. Roosevelt's team wanted to avoid alarming the public during wartime. They wanted to prevent enemies from seeing any weakness in American leadership. They wanted to protect Roosevelt's ability to govern without constant questions about his health. But the effect was to leave Truman completely unprepared. He walked into the presidency with no transition period, no gradual transfer of knowledge, no chance to learn from Roosevelt before taking over everything he needed to know. He had to learn on the job, while making life and death decisions about the war and the peace that would follow. The more Truman learned, the angrier he became, not just at Roosevelt's people, but at Roosevelt himself. Why hadn't the president prepared him? Why hadn't FDR taken even a few hours to brief his vice president on critical issues? Why had Roosevelt allowed this situation to develop, where the entire government depended on one man's knowledge and judgment? Truman would later write in his diary, Roosevelt's greatest mistake was believing he was irreplaceable. He built a system that only he could run, and when he died, it nearly fell apart. I've had to spend my first months in office just figuring out what the hell is going on, let alone making decisions. That's no way to run a government. This experience shaped everything that followed. When Truman started replacing Roosevelt officials, it wasn't just about loyalty or personality conflicts, it was about rebuilding the presidency as an institution that could function regardless of who held the office. It was about creating systems and documentation and clear chains of authority so that future transitions wouldn't be so chaotic. But in the summer of 1945, all of that was still ahead. First, Truman had to win the war, and to do that, he would have to work with the team he had inherited, even as he planned to replace them. Chapter 4: Truman's Background and Insecurities. To understand why Truman responded the way he did to Roosevelt's inner circle, you have to understand where he came from and how different his background was from the people around him. Harry Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri, on May 8, 1884. the son of a mule trader and farmer. His family moved several times during his childhood, eventually settling in Independence, Missouri. He grew up in a world of small-town America, far from the centers of power and privilege that shaped most of Roosevelt's advisors. Truman was an avid reader and an excellent student, particularly in history. He dreamed of attending West Point and pursuing a military career, but poor eyesight disqualified him. He couldn't afford college, so after graduating from high school in 1901, he worked a series of jobs: bank clerk, timekeeper for a railroad construction crew, help on the family farm. In 1906, when Truman was 22, he returned to the family farm near Grandview to help his father. He spent the next 8 years as a farmer, work he later described as the hardest of his life. He hated it, but he stuck with it out of duty to his family. During this time, he courted Bess Wallace, whom he had known since childhood. She refused his first marriage proposal in 1911, and they didn't marry until 1919, after he returned from World War I. When America entered the war in 1917, Truman volunteered, even though at 33 he could have claimed exemption. He served in France as an artillery captain, commanding Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery. His battery had a reputation for being undisciplined and ineffective, but Truman turned them into one of the best units in the division. This experience gave him confidence in his leadership abilities and a lifelong respect for the military. After the war, Truman returned to Independence and opened a haberdashery, a men's clothing store, with an army friend. The business failed during the 1921 recession, leaving Truman with debts he spent years paying off. This failure was humiliating, but it taught him about economic hardship and the impact of financial crises on ordinary people. In 1922, Truman entered politics with the help of Tom Pendergast, the boss of the Kansas City Democratic Machine. Pendergast's organization was notoriously corrupt, and Truman's association with it would haunt him throughout his career. His enemies would always claim he was Pendergast's man, a creature of machine politics who had bought his way into office. Truman served as a county judge, an administrative position, from 1922 to 1924, and again from 1926 to 1934. He was honest and competent. Unlike many Pendergast appointees, he built roads, improved county services, and earned a reputation for integrity. But the Pendergast connection remained a liability. In 1934, Truman ran for the United States Senate with Pendergast's backing. He won, but barely, and arrived in Washington as an unknown senator from a flyover state, tainted by association with a corrupt political machine. The Eastern establishment senators looked down on him. He was the senator from Pendergast, not a serious legislator in their eyes. Truman worked hard to prove himself. He studied Senate procedures. He learned the issues. He built relationships with other senators, particularly Southern Democrats who appreciated his plain-speaking style, but he remained an outsider to the power elite that dominated Washington. His big break came in 1941, when he chaired the special committee to investigate the National Defense Program, which became known as the Truman Committee. The committee investigated waste and fraud in wartime contracting, saving the government billions of dollars and earning Truman national recognition. For the first time, he was seen as more than just a machine politician. He was a serious leader who got results. This success made him an attractive vice presidential candidate in 1944. Party bosses wanted someone from the border states to balance the ticket, someone who was loyal but not ideological, someone who wouldn't threaten Roosevelt but could potentially succeed him. Truman fit perfectly. But Truman didn't want the job. He liked being a senator. He knew the vice presidency was powerless. His wife and daughter didn't want to move into the spotlight. He resisted until party leaders made it clear that Roosevelt wanted him on the ticket. Then, out of party loyalty, he accepted. The next 82 days were the most frustrating of his political life. He had no role, no responsibilities, no access to information. He presided over the Senate, which he knew how to do, but otherwise he was frozen out of governance. He met with Roosevelt twice, and both meetings were brief and formal. He was invited to social events, but not policy discussions. Truman later wrote, "I was vice president in name only." Roosevelt didn't want a partner. He wanted a successor he could control from the grave through his loyal staff. That was the plan. Keep Truman ignorant. Let him take the oath, then guide him in the right direction. Make sure Roosevelt's vision survived even after Roosevelt was gone. When Truman suddenly became president, he brought all of these insecurities with him. He had no college degree. In a cabinet full of Ivy League graduates, he came from a failed business background in a room full of successful lawyers and bankers. He spoke with a Missouri twang among men who prided themselves on sophisticated Eastern accents. He had been a farmer and a haberdasher among men who had always lived in centers of power. Roosevelt's inner circle didn't try to hide their doubts about Truman's competence. They would say things like, "President Roosevelt understood that," with the clear implication that Truman didn't. They would reference conversations and meetings that Truman hadn't been part of, making him feel like an outsider in his own administration. They would speak in the coded language of longtime colleagues, leaving Truman to figure out what they meant. This condescension infuriated Truman, but it also motivated him. He was determined to prove he was up to the job, not by imitating Roosevelt, but by being his own kind of president, a more direct, more straightforward, less manipulative leader who said what he meant and meant what he said. He would later tell an aide, "These Roosevelt people think I'm just a country bumpkin who got lucky. Well, maybe I am. But this country bumpkin is the president, and they're not. And if they can't accept that and work for me, instead of working for a dead man's memory, then they need to find other jobs." This mixture of insecurity and determination shaped everything Truman did in his first year. He was simultaneously trying to learn the job, establish his authority, make critical decisions about the war and peace, and deal with people who thought he was inadequate. It was an impossible situation, and the only way through it was to eventually replace those people with others who would give him the respect and loyalty he deserved. But first, he had to get through the immediate crises. And that meant working with the team he had, even as he planned to dismantle it. Chapter 5. The Transition and Replacements. The actual replacement of Roosevelt's team happened gradually, over 18 months, not in a dramatic 90-day purge. Understanding the real timeline is important because it shows that Truman was being strategic, not impulsive. He waited until he had established himself and found suitable replacements. Then he moved decisively. The first major departure was Frances Perkins. She had served as Secretary of Labor since 1933, the first woman in the cabinet, and a towering figure in New Deal history. She had helped create Social Security, the minimum wage, and federal labor protections. She was competent, experienced, and dedicated to workers' rights. But she was also completely devoted to Roosevelt's memory and made no secret of her belief that Truman wasn't the man for the job. In meetings, she would frequently say things like, "President Roosevelt's approach to this was," or "I think President Roosevelt would want us to." She couldn't seem to accept that Roosevelt was gone, and Truman was president now. On May 23, 1945, just 6 weeks after taking office, Truman requested Perkins' resignation. His letter was polite, but firm. He thanked her for her service, but made clear he wanted to appoint his own Labor Secretary. Perkins submitted her resignation the same day, effective June 30th. In later years, Perkins would write that she believed Truman was insecure and couldn't handle being compared to Roosevelt. She was probably right about the comparison bothering him, but wrong about why it wasn't insecurity. It was the fact that his own Labor Secretary kept suggesting that a dead president's judgment was more important than the living president's. Truman replaced Perkins with Louis Schwellenbach, a former senator from Washington state and a personal friend. Schwellenbach was competent, but not legendary. What mattered to Truman was that Schwellenbach would implement Truman's labor policies, not try to preserve Roosevelt's. The same day, Truman also requested the resignation of Francis Biddle, the Attorney General. Biddle was shocked. He had no warning. In fact, he learned about it from a newspaper report before Truman officially told him. Truman simply decided he wanted his own Attorney General and didn't bother with much explanation. When Biddle came to the Oval Office to confirm the news, Truman was blunt. "Yes, it's true. I'm making changes. I'll need your resignation." Biddle asked if there was any specific problem with his performance. Truman's answer revealed his thinking. "No, Francis, you've done fine work. But you were Roosevelt's Attorney General, and I need mine." Truman replaced Biddle with Tom Clark, a Texas lawyer who had worked on war fraud investigations and had become a Truman ally. Clark would serve loyally and eventually be appointed to the Supreme Court. But what mattered in 1945 was that he was Truman's man, not Roosevelt's. July brought the resignation of Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Treasury Secretary. Morgenthau had been one of Roosevelt's closest friends. They had lunch together every Monday for years. He had financed the New Deal and the war effort, raising more money than all previous Treasury secretaries combined. He assumed he would continue serving indefinitely. But Morgenthau made a critical mistake. He insisted on accompanying Truman to the Potsdam Conference, essentially threatening to resign if he wasn't included. Truman, who was already planning to replace him, accepted his resignation immediately. Truman had privately told aides he wouldn't bring any of those people to Potsdam, and he meant it. Morgenthau was devastated. He had expected to serve at least through the end of the war with Japan. Instead, he was out after just 3 months of the Truman administration. Truman replaced him with Fred Vinson, a former congressman and judge who would serve loyally before being appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. These 3 resignations in the spring and summer of 1945 sent a clear message. Truman was establishing his authority. Proximity to Roosevelt was now a liability, not an asset. If you couldn't accept that Harry Truman was the president and deserved the same loyalty Roosevelt had commanded, you needed to find other work. But the most dramatic firing wouldn't come until over a year later. Henry Wallace remained as Secretary of Commerce through 1945, and into 1946, Truman kept him, partly because Wallace was popular with liberal Democrats, and Truman needed their support. But Wallace couldn't stay quiet about his disagreements with Truman's foreign policy. Wallace believed the United States should maintain friendly relations with the Soviet Union. He thought Truman was being too confrontational, too quick to see Stalin as an enemy. Throughout 1946, Wallace pressed these views in cabinet meetings and in private conversations with the president. Truman tolerated this for a while. He valued diverse opinions and didn't want to be accused of purging anyone who disagreed with him. But Wallace went too far on September 12, 1946, when he delivered a speech at Madison Square Garden calling for a softer line toward the Soviet Union. The speech directly contradicted Truman's policy and embarrassed Secretary of State James Burns, who was in Paris trying to negotiate with the Soviets from a position of strength, Truman was furious. He demanded Wallace's resignation on September 20th, ending one of the most contentious relationships in the cabinet. Wallace's firing was different from the others. Perkins, Biddle, and Morgenthau were asked to resign because they were Roosevelt loyalists. Wallace was fired because he publicly undermined the president's policy. But the result was the same. Another key figure from Roosevelt's inner circle was gone. Other departures happened more quietly. Harry Hopkins resigned in July 1945 due to his failing health. He would die 6 months later. Edward Stettinius, who had briefly been Secretary of State, was replaced by James Burns within months of Truman taking office. Sam Rosenman resigned as White House counsel in February 1946, though he remained friendly with Truman. Admiral William Leahy technically remained as Chief of Staff, but Truman gradually marginalized him, excluding him from key meetings and making decisions without consulting him. By 1946, Leahy was a figurehead. He wouldn't officially retire until 1949, but his real power ended much earlier. By the end of 1946, the cabinet was almost entirely new. Truman had replaced or marginalized virtually everyone who had been close to Roosevelt. The White House staff had been turned over completely. Even career civil servants who had worked closely with Roosevelt found themselves reassigned or encouraged to retire. This wasn't a paranoid purge or petty revenge. It was a president establishing control over his administration. Truman couldn't govern effectively while constantly being second-guessed by people who thought they knew better because they had worked for Roosevelt. He couldn't implement his policies when his own cabinet members were trying to preserve Roosevelt's legacy instead of serving the current president. The transition did have costs. Truman lost access to enormous institutional knowledge and experience. People who had managed the New Deal and guided the war effort were replaced by loyal allies who sometimes lacked their predecessors' expertise. Foreign policy in particular suffered from the loss of people who understood Roosevelt's complex relationships with Churchill and Stalin. But Truman judged this an acceptable price for establishing his authority. He would rather struggle with inexperienced but loyal staff than rely on experienced staff who undermined him, and in the long run, this decision proved correct. Truman was able to pursue his own policies, make his own decisions, and ultimately be judged on his own merits, rather than as Roosevelt's pale successor. Years later, when asked why he had replaced so many Roosevelt people so quickly, Truman's answer was consistent. "I couldn't trust them. They were loyal to a dead man, not to me. They thought I was inadequate and tried to guide me instead of serve me. You can't govern if your own staff is working against you. So I got rid of them and found people who believed in Harry Truman." Simple as that. It was a harsh assessment, but not entirely unfair. The Roosevelt transition remains one of the most dramatic in American history, not because Truman was vindictive, but because the situation he inherited was genuinely impossible without major personnel changes. Chapter 6. Global Consequences of the Transition. The wholesale replacement of Roosevelt's foreign policy team had profound consequences for the emerging Cold War. To understand how, you need to look at the fundamental difference in worldview between Roosevelt's people and Truman's. Roosevelt's inner circle, especially Henry Wallace and others who had worked closely with FDR during the war, believed that cooperation with the Soviet Union was possible and necessary. They had seen the Soviets as allies in defeating Hitler. They believed Stalin could be worked with if America showed good faith and respect for Soviet security concerns. This view was shaped by the wartime alliance. America and the Soviet Union had fought together against Nazi Germany. Millions of Soviets had died Defeating the Wehrmacht American aid through Lend-Lease had helped the Soviet war effort. There seemed to be a basis for continued partnership. Truman started with this same assumption. In his first months, he tried to continue Roosevelt's policy of working with Stalin. But as he learned more about Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe, about the communist takeover of Poland, about Soviet pressure on Iran and Turkey, he became increasingly skeptical. By early 1946, Truman had concluded that Stalin wasn't interested in genuine cooperation. He was interested in expanding Soviet power wherever possible. The wartime alliance had been a marriage of convenience, and now that the war was over, the fundamental conflicts between American democracy and Soviet communism were reasserting themselves. This shift in thinking led to the Truman Doctrine in March 1947. Speaking to Congress, Truman declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This was the policy of containment, the idea that America needed to prevent the spread of communism rather than hoping to convert the Soviets to democracy. The Marshall Plan followed in June 1947. America would provide massive economic aid to help Western Europe rebuild, not just out of humanitarian concern, but to prevent economic desperation from pushing European countries toward communism. Over 4 years, America would invest over $13 billion, equivalent to well over $100 billion today, in European reconstruction. These policies shaped the next 40 years of American foreign policy. Containment became the organizing principle of American strategy throughout the Cold War. The commitment to defend Western Europe led to NATO in 1949. The willingness to resist communist expansion led to American involvement in Korea, Vietnam, and countless other conflicts around the world. Would Roosevelt have pursued these same policies? It's impossible to know for certain, but many of his advisors believed he would have taken a different approach. They thought Roosevelt would have been more flexible, more willing to accept a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe in exchange for cooperation elsewhere. Henry Wallace argued loudly and publicly that Truman's hardline approach was a mistake that would lead to an arms race and possibly World War III. He broke with the Democratic Party and ran for president in 1948 on the Progressive Party ticket, calling for friendlier relations with the Soviet Union. He received just over 1 million votes and no electoral votes, suggesting most Americans supported Truman's tougher stance. The Berlin airlift in 1948 and 1949 demonstrated Truman's determination to stand up to Soviet pressure. When Stalin blockaded West Berlin, trying to force the Western powers out, Truman ordered an airlift to supply the city. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew supplies into Berlin, successfully breaking the blockade without starting a war. The creation of NATO in 1949 formalized America's commitment to defending Western Europe. For the first time in its history, the United States entered a peacetime military alliance. This represented a fundamental break with American tradition and was directly counter to the isolationism that had dominated American thinking before World War II. The Korean War in 1950 to 1953 was another consequence of Truman's approach. When Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, Truman immediately committed American forces under United Nations authority. He framed the conflict as a test of whether the free world would resist communist aggression. The war ended in stalemate, but it established the principle that America would fight to contain communism. These policies emerged from Truman's team, not Roosevelt's. The people Truman appointed, led by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who replaced James Burns in 1949, were harder line than their predecessors. They believed in confronting Soviet expansion, not accommodating it. It's worth noting that by 1950, Even former Roosevelt advisors were moving toward this harder line. The Soviet explosion of an atomic bomb in 1949, the fall of China to communism the same year, and increasing evidence of Soviet espionage in America convinced many former skeptics that Truman had been right to be suspicious of Stalin. Henry Wallace himself eventually admitted he had been wrong. In a 1952 article, he wrote that he now considered the Soviet Union utterly evil and supported Truman's policy in Korea. But by then, Truman's approach had been American policy for years. The contrast is instructive. Roosevelt had tried to manage Stalin through personal diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. Truman relied on clear commitments. Backed by military and economic power, Roosevelt had believed in great power cooperation to manage the post-war world. Truman created an alliance system based on shared democratic values. Whether Roosevelt's approach would have worked is unknowable. He died before the post-war situation fully developed. But Truman's approach, forged partly in reaction against Roosevelt's team and their assumptions, defined American foreign policy for a generation and arguably won the Cold War. The transition from Roosevelt to Truman wasn't just about replacing personnel, it was about replacing an entire worldview, a fundamental shift in how America engaged with the world. And that shift happened in part because Truman cleared out the people who would have resisted it. Chapter 7. Eleanor Roosevelt, the final relationship. No discussion of Truman's relationship with Roosevelt's legacy would be complete without addressing Eleanor Roosevelt. She wasn't a government official, but she was arguably the most powerful woman in American politics, and her ongoing influence created unique challenges for Truman. Eleanor had been much more than a traditional First Lady. She had been a political partner to Franklin, especially after his polio made him less mobile. She had traveled constantly, serving as his eyes and ears. She had advocated for civil rights, women's rights, and social welfare programs. She had written a daily newspaper column and given regular speeches. By 1945, she was a political force in her own right. When Franklin died, Eleanor assumed the role of guardian of his legacy. She believed she understood what Franklin had wanted for post-war America, and she saw it as her duty to work for those goals, regardless of what the new president thought. Initially, Truman tried to maintain good relations. He respected Eleanor's contributions and wanted to keep her in the Democratic coalition. He appointed her as a delegate to the United Nations, where she would chair the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of her greatest achievements. But Eleanor couldn't resist offering advice, often in ways that implied Truman wasn't living up to Franklin's standards. She sent him letters criticizing his handling of labor disputes, suggesting he wasn't being true to Roosevelt's commitment to workers' rights. She publicly advocated for causes she believed Franklin would have supported, sometimes in ways that put pressure on Truman. The breaking point came in October 1945, when Eleanor sent Truman a long letter about labor policy. She criticized his approach and suggested he was betraying Roosevelt's vision. Truman's response was icy. He wrote back, thanking her for her perspective, but making clear that he was the president now and had to make decisions based on current circumstances, not on what Roosevelt might have done in different situations. Eleanor got the message. Her direct influence on White House policy ended that day. She continued her work at the UN and remained active in democratic politics, but she stopped trying to tell Truman how to do his job. Their relationship remained complicated for years. Eleanor never fully trusted Truman's judgment. She had supported the effort to deny him the vice presidential nomination in 1944, preferring Henry Wallace. After Truman fired Wallace in 1946, Eleanor's doubts about him deepened, but Eleanor also gradually came to respect some of Truman's decisions. His support for the State of Israel in 1948 impressed her. His civil rights initiatives, including desegregating the military, showed courage she hadn't expected from a border state politician. His commitment to the UN and to international cooperation aligned with her own values. By the time Truman left office in 1953, Eleanor had developed a grudging respect for him. She would later write that while Truman never had Franklin's vision or political skill, he had proven himself to be a decent, honest man who did his best in difficult circumstances. It wasn't the glowing endorsement Truman might have wanted, but it was significant coming from Eleanor Roosevelt. Truman, for his part, never warmed to Eleanor. He found her self-righteousness annoying and her constant references to Franklin tiresome. But he respected her work at the UN and her commitment to human rights. When she died in 1962, he attended her funeral and spoke movingly about her contributions to America. The Eleanor-Roosevelt relationship illustrates a key aspect of the Roosevelt transition. Truman wasn't just replacing officials, he was navigating a political landscape where Roosevelt's memory was invoked constantly as a weapon against him. Every decision was compared to what Roosevelt would have done. Every policy was measured against Roosevelt's supposed intentions. This would have been difficult regardless of personnel, but it was made much harder by having Roosevelt loyalists throughout the government, constantly reminding Truman that he wasn't Roosevelt and suggesting that his different approach was inferior. By replacing these people, Truman freed himself from this comparison. He could be his own kind of president, judged on his own merits. It took over a year to complete the transition, but by 1947, the government was clearly Truman's, not Roosevelt's shadow. Eleanor's acceptance of this reality, however grudging, symbolized the larger transition. Roosevelt was gone. Truman was president, and America would move forward under new leadership, shaped by new decisions, facing new challenges in a rapidly changing world. Chapter 8. The Legacy. Was Truman right? Historians remain divided on whether Truman's wholesale replacement of Roosevelt's team was necessary or wise. The debate reveals important questions about presidential transitions, institutional knowledge, and political loyalty. Those who defend Truman's decisions argue that he faced an impossible situation. He had inherited an administration built entirely around Roosevelt's personality and judgment. The people in that administration had kept him deliberately uninformed when he was vice president. They continued to invoke Roosevelt's name and authority to limit Truman's options after he became president. They saw themselves as guardians of a legacy rather than servants of the sitting president. Under these circumstances, Truman had no choice but to replace them. He couldn't govern effectively while constantly being second-guessed by people who thought they knew better. He needed people who would present him with honest options and then implement his decisions, not people who would try to manipulate him toward predetermined conclusions. Moreover, Truman's policies proved successful. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. NATO deterred Soviet aggression. The Berlin airlift demonstrated American resolve without starting a war. The Truman Doctrine established containment as the organizing principle of American foreign policy, a strategy that would eventually win the Cold War. Could Roosevelt's team have implemented these policies? Probably not with the same conviction. Many of them were skeptical of confronting the Soviet Union. They believed in great power cooperation and were uncomfortable with the alliance system Truman built. If Truman had kept them in place, American policy likely would have been more accommodating to Soviet demands, possibly allowing greater communist expansion in Europe and Asia. Critics of Truman's approach argue that he overreacted to legitimate policy disagreements. Roosevelt's team wasn't trying to undermine him. They were trying to provide continuity and institutional memory during a difficult transition. They had expertise that Truman lacked, and replacing them meant losing valuable knowledge about how the government actually worked. The loss of institutional memory had real costs. Truman's early foreign policy was sometimes clumsy because his team didn't understand relationships and commitments that Roosevelt had built over years of personal diplomacy. His domestic policy struggled because the people who had managed the New Deal programs were gone, replaced by less experienced loyalists. Moreover, some historians argue that Truman's suspicions were exaggerated. Yes, Roosevelt's people invoked his memory, but this was natural given that Roosevelt had been president for 12 years and had just died. It wasn't a conspiracy to undermine Truman. It was people trying to maintain continuity during an uncertain time. The debate over Henry Wallace is particularly instructive. Truman kept him as Commerce Secretary for over a year. Despite their policy disagreements, Wallace only was fired when he publicly contradicted administration policy. This suggests Truman was willing to tolerate disagreement, even from Roosevelt loyalists, as long as they remained loyal to the sitting president. The problem wasn't policy disagreement. It was the perception that some Roosevelt holdovers were more loyal to a dead president's vision than to the living president's authority. A middle ground interpretation suggests that some replacements were necessary while others were excessive. Clearly, Truman needed to replace people in key policy positions who fundamentally disagreed with his approach. But did he need to clear out the entire White House staff? Did he need to push out career civil servants who had worked with Roosevelt but had no policy role? This interpretation suggests Truman was right to replace his cabinet, but could have kept more of the institutional infrastructure intact. A more confident president might have kept experienced staff while making clear that policy direction came from him, not from Roosevelt's memory. But this assumes a confidence Truman didn't have in early 1945. He was genuinely uncertain about his abilities. He had been kept in the dark and felt like an outsider under these circumstances. Surrounding himself with people who believed in him rather than in Roosevelt's ghost made psychological sense, even if it created administrative costs. The long-term impact of Truman's transition goes beyond the specific individuals he replaced. He established a principle that would affect future transitions. A new president has the right to build their own team, even when succeeding a president of the same party. Before Truman, it was common for new presidents to keep much of their predecessor's team, especially in the same party. After Truman, wholesale cabinet changes became the norm. Every president now expects to choose their own people, and holdovers from the previous administration are the exception rather than the rule. This has advantages and disadvantages. It gives new presidents freedom to implement their own policies without resistance from loyal opposition within their own administration. But it also means that every transition involves significant loss of expertise and institutional memory. Truman himself never expressed regret about his decisions. In his memoirs and in interviews throughout his retirement, he consistently defended the personnel changes he believed he couldn't have governed effectively with Roosevelt's team, and he insisted that the proof was in his accomplishments. And his accomplishments were substantial. The successful conclusion of World War II, the establishment of the United Nations, the Marshall Plan and NATO desegregation of the military, support for civil rights, the Fair Deal domestic agenda, the defense of South Korea. These weren't the actions of an incompetent caretaker president. They were the record of a leader who established his own vision and pursued it vigorously. Whether Roosevelt would have achieved more or less is unknowable. What matters is that Truman was able to lead in his own way, make his own decisions, and be judged on his own record that would not have been possible if he had remained surrounded by Roosevelt's advisors, constantly being reminded that he wasn't Roosevelt and being encouraged to simply maintain his predecessor's policies. The final verdict on Truman has been rendered by history. He left office in 1953, deeply unpopular, with approval ratings in the 20s. The Korean War had dragged on into stalemate. His domestic agenda had been blocked by Congress. Corruption scandals had tarnished his administration. Many Americans saw him as an accidental president who had been in over his head. But historical assessments have been much kinder. Most presidential historians now rank Truman in the top 10 presidents, often in the top 5. They credit him with successfully navigating the post-war transition, containing Soviet expansion, establishing the foundations of American leadership of the free world, and beginning the long process of addressing civil rights. This rehabilitation suggests that Truman was right to trust his own judgment rather than deferring to Roosevelt's legacy. He made his own decisions, took responsibility for them, and ultimately shaped the modern world in ways that vindicated his approach. The story of Truman's transition isn't a simple tale of revenge or purge. It's a complex story of a president establishing his authority in an impossible situation. It's about the tension between continuity and change. It's about the challenge of following a giant. And it's about the courage to lead in your own way, even when everyone is telling you that you're not good enough and should simply maintain what came before. Harry Truman faced a choice. He could be Roosevelt's caretaker, implementing policies designed by others, guided by advisors loyal to a dead man's vision, or he could be his own president, making his own decisions, building his own team, and accepting responsibility for his own record. He chose to be his own president. History suggests he chose correctly. Conclusion: April 12, 1945. Harry Truman walked into the White House as the most unprepared president in American history. He had been vice president for 82 days. He had met with Roosevelt twice. He knew nothing about the atomic bomb, the state of negotiations with Stalin, or the details of post-war planning. 18 months later, he had completely rebuilt the executive branch. Every member of Roosevelt's cabinet was gone or had been pushed to the margins. The White House staff had been replaced. New policies were emerging that would define the next generation of American leadership. This transformation wasn't a petty purge driven by insecurity. It was a necessary restructuring, driven by the reality that Truman couldn't govern while surrounded by people who saw him as inadequate and who believed their primary duty was preserving Roosevelt's legacy rather than serving the sitting president. The transition had costs. Institutional knowledge was lost. Expertise was replaced by loyalty. Some early decisions were made without the benefit of experience that Roosevelt's team could have provided. But the transition also had benefits. Truman established clear presidential authority. He assembled a team that believed in him and would implement his decisions. He freed himself from constant comparisons to Roosevelt and was able to develop his own approach to governing. The policies that emerged from Truman's administration shaped the modern world. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the Truman Doctrine, desegregation of the military support for civil rights. These weren't Roosevelt's policies implemented by Truman. They were Truman's policies, developed by his team, reflecting his judgment. Whether Roosevelt would have pursued the same course is unknowable. What matters is that Truman was able to lead, to decide, to act. And that wouldn't have been possible if he had remained in Roosevelt's shadow, guided by Roosevelt's advisors, constantly being told what Roosevelt would have done. The story of Truman's transition offers lessons for any leader following a dominant predecessor. You cannot lead while living in someone else's shadow. You cannot make bold decisions while being constantly reminded that you're not as good as the person who came before. You cannot build trust with your team if they're more loyal to the previous leader than to you. Sometimes, to move forward, you have to clear the deck. You have to replace people, even competent and experienced people, because the relationship cannot work. You have to accept the costs of lost expertise in exchange for the benefit of clear authority. Truman understood this instinctively. His background had taught him about loyalty, about trust, about the importance of having people around you who believe in you. He knew he couldn't succeed with Roosevelt's team, so he built his own. And in doing so, he became not just Roosevelt's successor, but his own man, his own president, leading America through perhaps the most consequential period in its history. History remembers Harry Truman not as the man who wasn't Roosevelt, but as the president who established containment, who rebuilt Europe, who stood up to Stalin, who integrated the military, and who showed that an ordinary man from Missouri could rise to extraordinary challenges. That legacy wouldn't have been possible without the difficult decisions Truman made in 1945 and 1946. The decisions to replace Roosevelt's team, to build his own administration, to trust his own judgment instead of deferring to the advisors who had served his predecessor. It was a ruthless transition, a dramatic transformation, a wholesale rebuilding of the executive branch. It was also necessary, successful, and ultimately vindicated by history. Harry Truman walked into an impossible inheritance. He dismantled an empire he didn't understand and couldn't control. And he built something new, something his own, something that would endure long after both he and Roosevelt were gone. That's the story of Truman's first 18 months. Not a purge, not revenge, but a necessary transition from one era of American leadership to another, from Roosevelt's personal, improvisational, coalition-building style to Truman's more direct, institutional, principle-based approach. Both men were great presidents, but they were different kinds of leaders. And for Truman to become his own kind of great, he first had to free himself from Roosevelt's legacy. That meant replacing Roosevelt's people, all of them, and accepting the consequences, good and bad, of that decision. In the end, Harry Truman proved himself worthy of the office he inherited, not by being another Roosevelt, but by being Harry Truman. And that's what history remembers.